Good morning. I'm Judge Frank Caprio. For nearly 40 years sitting on this bench, looking down over the Providence courtroom, I thought I had witnessed every shade of human nature. I have seen liars who don't blink. I have seen tears of late remorse, and I have seen lives crushed by the cold machinery of fate. But on that bleak Tuesday morning in November, when case file number 30422B was placed on my desk, I had no idea I was about to face one of the cruelest incidents in the history of my career. It wasn't a murder case or a robbery. On paper, it was just a minor civil dispute regarding employment contract compensation. But the way this case unfolded, the way the arrogance of the powerful trampled upon the desperation of the weak, made my blood boil in a way I rarely allow to happen. Let me take you back to that moment. The clock read 9:15 a.m. The air in the courtroom was heavy, perhaps due to the freezing rain outside. The doors opened, and Sarah Miller walked in. She was the defendant in today's case. Sarah looked much older than the 28 years listed in her file. She wore a thin coat, frayed at the wrists, completely inadequate against the Rhode Island chill. Her eyes were dark and hollow, sunken deep signs of long, sleepless nights. In her hands, she didn't hold a briefcase or legal documents, but an old, worn-out handbag stuffed with crumpled bills and medicine bottles. She walked timidly, her shoulders slumped, as if she were carrying the weight of the world. As she stood before my bench, I could see her hands shaking violently, gripping the railing just to keep from collapsing. She bore the look of a mother who had reached the absolute limit of her endurance. And then the plaintiff entered. The contrast was so brutal it silenced the entire courtroom. Walking in behind Sarah was Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Logistics, one of the largest transport companies in the state. Richard did not come alone. He was flanked by two lawyers in bespoke suits, the kind worth enough to feed Sarah's family for an entire year. Richard Sterling reeked of money and power. He walked with the confidence of a man who has never had to bow his head to anyone. On his wrist was a solid gold Rolex, glinting offensively under the fluorescent courtroom lights. He didn't even glance at Sarah. Instead, he pulled out the latest smartphone, scrolling through it with a bored expression, as if his presence here was an insult to his precious time. "Your Honor," Richard's lead attorney spoke, his tone smooth and icy, "we are here to request the enforcement of a breach of contract penalty amounting to $5,000 against Miss Sarah Miller. 5,000 yuan. That number hung in the air. I looked over at Sarah. Her face went pale, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. For a man like Richard Sterling, $5,000 was likely just the cost of a client dinner. But looking at Sarah's worn-down shoes, I knew that for her, that number was a death sentence. "Mr. Sterling," I spoke up, lowering my voice to command his attention. "I see in the file that you are suing your former employee for breach of training contract and quitting without notice. Could you please put your phone away and tell me why you are so determined to pursue a woman who is standing there trembling before you?" Richard Sterling sighed, a sigh full of theatrical condescension. He slid the phone into his suit pocket, adjusted his silk tie, and looked at me with cold eyes. "Judge Caprio," he said, his voice booming with authority, the voice of a man used to commanding hundreds of employees. "The law is the law. Miss Miller here signed an employment contract. Our company invested money to train her. The contract clearly states, if she quits before 6 months or leaves without just cause, she must repay training costs and compensate for lost revenue. She walked out of her shift on the busiest day of the year, bringing my assembly line to a halt. I run a business, not a charity. If I let her off the hook, my 500 other employees will think they can walk out whenever they please." I looked at him, then back at Sarah. There was another story here. I was certain of it. In 38 years, my intuition has rarely been wrong. The cold cruelty in Richard Sterling's argument was too perfect, too logical, but it lacked one fundamental thing: humanity. "Miss Miller," I turned to the young mother, "Mr. Sterling says you walked out on your job and caused damage to the company. Do you have anything to say? Why did you leave that critical shift?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stifle a sob. She opened her battered handbag, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and placed it on my bench. Her hand shook so hard the paper rustled loudly in the silent room. "Your Honor," her voice cracked, hoarse with emotion. I didn't want to quit. That job was all I had to feed my child. But that day, my daughter, little Emily, she paused, covering her mouth with her hand. The entire courtroom held its breath. "What about Emily?" I asked gently, trying to reassure her. "She's only 4 years old, Your Honor," Sarah continued, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "She has acute leukemia. That morning, the kindergarten called. She collapsed. Blood was pouring from her nose, and it wouldn't stop. I called my manager. I called Mr. Sterling directly. I begged them to let me go. I told them my daughter was in an ambulance, on her way to the ICU. But she lifted her eyes to look at Richard Sterling, a gaze not filled with hatred, but with absolute, crushing sorrow. But he told me, if I walked out that door, don't ever come back." The silence that followed Sarah's statement was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. I looked at the young mother, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Then, slowly, I turned my gaze to Richard Sterling. I expected to see shame. I expected to see him shift uncomfortably, perhaps signal his lawyers to withdraw the motion, or at the very least, look down at his expensive Italian shoes. Instead, Richard Sterling checked his watch. He actually checked his watch, as if Sarah's recounting of her daughter's medical emergency was a boring commercial break in the movie of his life. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dangerously low, "did you hear what Miss Miller just said?" Richard looked up, an expression of mild annoyance crossing his face. "I heard her, Your Honor, and while it is a unfortunate situation, it is also irrelevant to the legal matter at hand. We are discussing a breach of contract. Clause 4, Section B. Abandonment of duties during peak operational hours results in immediate termination and liability for damages. It's black and white." He tapped the document in front of him with a manicured finger. "Everyone has a sob story, Judge. If I made an exception for every sick relative, every flat tire, every emergency, Sterling Logistics would cease to function. Miss Miller made a choice. She chose to leave. That choice has a price tag. $5,000. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just that he lacked empathy. It was that he viewed empathy as a weakness, a business inefficiency to be eliminated. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning forward over the bench. "You are telling this court that when Miss Miller called you, while her 4-year-old daughter was bleeding uncontrollably in an ambulance, you told her that if she went to be with her dying child, she was fired?" "I told her that if she left her post, she was violating her contract," Sterling corrected, his tone icy. "I run a tight ship. She knew the rules. She walked out. That is a resignation in my book." "It wasn't a resignation," Sarah cried out, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and sudden, fierce anger. "I begged you, Mr. Sterling. I told you I would come back for the night shift once she was stabilized. I told you I needed the money for her chemo. You told me I was easily replaceable and that I should get my priorities straight." "And you should have," Sterling shot back, not even looking at her. "Priorities are about honoring commitments. You signed a paper." I picked up the crumpled paper Sarah had placed on my bench earlier. I smoothed it out. It was an admission report from Hasbro Children's Hospital. The date matched the date of the alleged breach of contract. The diagnosis: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Condition upon arrival: critical. I held the paper up. "Mr. Sterling, this is a medical report stating that Emily Miller was admitted to the ICU at 10:15 a.m. Is this the time you claim Miss Miller abandoned her post?" "Around that time?" "Yes," Sterling admitted, bored. "So, you are suing this woman," I continued, letting the absurdity of the statement fill the room, "not only for firing her during the worst crisis of her life, but you are now trying to extract $5,000 from her money. She likely needs to keep her child alive because she chose to hold her daughter's hand in the hospital instead of packing boxes in your warehouse? Sterling's lawyer, sensing the temperature in the room dropping to freezing, stood up. Your Honor, with all due respect, the emotional context, while tragic, does not negate the contractual obligation. The defendant cost the company significant delays. Sit down, counselor, I snapped. I didn't look at the lawyer. My eyes were locked on Richard Sterling. I am talking to your client. Mr. Sterling, you are a successful man. I see the suit. I see the watch. I assume Sterling Logistics is profitable? We netted $12 million last quarter, Sterling said, a smirk touching his lips. He thought I was complimenting him. He thought money was the language we were speaking. $12 million, I repeated. And yet, here you are, chasing a single mother for $5,000. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, do you have children? For the first time, Richard Sterling's mask slipped, just a fraction. He stiffened. I have a son. He's at boarding school. If your son was in an ambulance, I asked, my voice rising, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. If your son was bleeding and calling for his father, and you were in a meeting, would you stay in that meeting? Or would you burn the building down to get to him? That's different, Sterling scoffed. I own the company. I make the rules. She is an employee. She is a cog in the machine. Cogs don't get to decide when the machine stops. A gasp went through the gallery. Even Sterling's lawyers looked down at their desks, unable to meet the gaze of anyone in the room. He had just said the quiet part out loud. He had admitted that to him, Sarah wasn't a person. She was a part. A broken part to be discarded and billed for the inconvenience. I looked at Sarah. She had stopped crying. She was looking at Sterling with a look of utter defeat. She believed him. She believed she was just a cog. She believed that because he had money and a contract, he had the right to destroy her. Mr. Sterling, I said, and a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done. In this courtroom, we don't deal with cogs. We deal with human beings. You seem to have forgotten the difference. You walked in here thinking this was a math problem, a simple calculation of breach plus damages equals payment. But you made a miscalculation. Sterling raised an eyebrow. And what is that? You assumed, I said, picking up my gavel, that the law is blind to cruelty. You assumed that justice is just a calculator for the rich. But today, I am going to introduce you to a concept that clearly wasn't in your business school curriculum. I turned to my bailiff. Quinn, please hand me the file on Mr. Sterling's company labor violations that we pulled from the state archives this morning. Sterling's face went white. The smirk vanished. You didn't think I would come into this hearing unprepared, did you? I opened the new folder. It seems Miss Miller isn't the first mother you've tried to crush, but she might be the last. The sound of the file hitting my desk wasn't loud, but in the hush of the courtroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Richard Sterling's eyes darted from the folder to his lawyers, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine panic. He knew what was in there. He knew that his carefully manicured reputation as a business titan was merely a thin veneer over a foundation of exploitation. Objection! The lead lawyer shouted, jumping to his feet so fast his chair nearly tipped over. Your Honor, this is an ambuscade. Any prior complaints against Sterling Logistics are irrelevant to Miss Miller's specific breach of contract. Those matters were settled out of court. They are sealed under non-disclosure agreements. Sealed from the public, perhaps, I said, my voice steady and cold. But this is a court of equity. When a plaintiff comes before me seeking damages, they must do so with clean hands. And looking at this file, Mr. Sterling, your hands are filthy. I opened the folder. The pages were thick with misery. Let's look at the relevance, shall we? I began reading, ensuring my voice carried to the back of the room where the cameras were rolling. Complaint filed May 2021. An employee fired for time theft because he took an extra 10 minutes on his lunch break to inject insulin. Complaint filed August 2021. A pregnant woman terminated 2 weeks before her maternity leave was set to begin, citing restructuring. She was replaced 3 days later by a cheaper, younger hire. I looked up. Sterling was jaw-clenched. his face turning a blotchy red. And here, I pointed to a document, complaint filed just last month. You deducted the cost of uniforms from employees' final paychecks, dropping their wages below the federal minimum. This isn't a business model, Mr. Sterling. This is a predation model. I employ thousands of people in this state, Sterling shouted, losing his cool. I provide jobs. I fuel the economy. You're cherry-picking a few disgruntled workers to paint me as a monster. These are standard industry practices. Standard? I asked, incredulous. Is it standard to treat people like disposable batteries? You use them up and throw them away when they run out of charge? I turned back to Sarah Miller. She was watching this exchange with wide eyes. She had likely felt small and isolated her entire time at the company, believing her suffering was unique. Now, she was realizing she was part of a graveyard of broken spirits. Sarah, I asked gently, is this true? Were you aware of these practices? Sarah gripped the railing, her knuckles white. Your Honor, we were terrified. There's a sign in the break room. It says, if you don't want to be here, there are 10 people outside waiting for your spot. They time our bathroom breaks. If we go over 3 minutes, we get a strike. 3 strikes, you're fired. On the day Emily got sick, I was already on 2 strikes because I had to take a call from her doctor the week before. A murmur of disgust rippled through the gallery. Even the stenographer stopped for a moment, looking at Sterling with open disdain. So, I summarized, piecing the narrative together, for the record. You didn't just leave because of an emergency. You left knowing that by prioritizing your dying child, you were triggering a mechanism designed to destroy you. You knew you would be fired, but you went anyway. I had to, Sarah whispered. She was calling for me. Mr. Sterling. I turned my attention back to the CEO. You are suing this woman for $5,000 in training costs. But according to Sarah's testimony and these complaints, the training seems to consist mostly of intimidation tactics. Can you provide an itemized receipt of this $5,000 investment you made in Miss Miller? Sterling looked at his lawyer. The lawyer shuffled some papers, looking flustered. Well, Your Honor, it's a flat fee, administrative costs, HR onboarding. The uniform she returned? I asked Sarah. Yes, Your Honor. I washed it and brought it back the next day, she confirmed. So, I leaned back. You are charging her a flat penalty disguised as training costs. In legal terms, Mr. Sterling, we call that a liquidated damages clause that functions as a penalty. And in the state of Rhode Island, contract penalties designed solely to punish employees for leaving are unenforceable. Sterling's lawyer stepped in, trying to salvage the sinking ship. Your Honor, the contract was reviewed by top corporate counsel. It is binding. Not in my courtroom, it isn't, I snapped. But we are past the contract now. We are looking at something much darker. Mr. Sterling, you admitted earlier that you fired her the moment she walked out. That means you terminated the contract. You cannot sue for breach of a contract that you yourself severed in a fit of pique. She abandoned her post. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. I have rights. I have a business to run. You think because you wear a robe you understand the real world? In the real world, weakness is a liability. If I let her get away with this, I look weak. Weakness, I repeated the word, tasting the bile in it. You think mercy is weakness? You think compassion is a liability? Mr. Sterling, let me tell you what I see from this bench. I see a mother who faced the ultimate terror, losing her child, and chose love over fear. That is strength. What I see at the plaintiff's table is a man so fragile, so insecure in his power, that he has to crush a woman making minimum wage just to feel big. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket aggressively. I've had enough of this lecture. If you're going to dismiss the case, just dismiss it. I have a lunch reservation at Capriccio's. He thought it was over. He thought the worst thing that could happen was that he wouldn't get his $5,000. He thought he could just walk out, get in his Bentley, and forget Sarah Miller ever existed. He was wrong. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, I ordered, my voice thundering. I did not dismiss the case. And you are certainly not going to lunch. Sterling froze. Excuse me? You brought this case into my house, I said, pointing a finger at him. You invoked the power of the judicial system to harass this woman. You wanted the law involved? Well, the law is involved now, and the law has questions for you that go far beyond a breach of contract. I looked at my bailiff. Quinn, lock the doors. Nobody leaves. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to electric. Sterling looked around, realizing for the first time that his money had no currency here. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. What I am about to do, I said, looking at the terrified mother and the arrogant tycoon, is something I have never done in a civil dispute. But extraordinary cruelty requires extraordinary justice. The lock on the courtroom doors clicked shut with a heavy, metallic thud. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, bouncing off the high ceilings and settling like a weight in the center of the room. Richard Sterling spun around to look at the bailiff, then back at me, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "This is false imprisonment," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "You cannot hold me here. I am calling the governor. I am calling the Bar Association. You will be disbarred for this stunt, Caprio." He reached for his phone again, his fingers fumbling with the screen. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a razor. "You are free to call whomever you like. Call the president for all I care. But until I am satisfied that justice, true justice, has been served in this room, you are not stepping 1 foot outside those doors. And if you disrupt my court one more time with that cell phone, I will hold you in contempt, and you will spend the night in the ACI. Do you understand me?" Sterling froze. He looked at his lawyers for help. The lead attorney, who had been so confident moments ago, was now staring at his shoes, clearly realizing they had walked into a trap of their own making. He whispered something to Sterling, and the CEO slowly lowered his phone, his eyes burning with hatred. "Good," I said, settling back into my chair. "Now, let's talk about this contract you are so fond of." I picked up the document Sterling had submitted as evidence. "You are suing Miss Miller for $5,000. You claim this covers training, administrative costs, and lost productivity. But I noticed something interesting in the fine print. Clause 9. Company reserves the right to withhold final paychecks to offset any debts owed by the employee." I looked up at Sarah. "Miss Miller, when you left the company that day to rush to your daughter, did you receive your final paycheck?" Sarah shook her head, wiping tears from her cheeks. "No, Your Honor. I had worked 2 weeks, plus 20 hours of overtime during the holiday rush. I never got paid for any of it. When I called HR, they said, Mr. Sterling ordered it to be held against the $5,000 I owed." "I see," I said, turning my gaze back to Sterling. "So, not only are you suing her for $5,000, but you have already pocketed her wages? How much was that paycheck, Miss Miller, with the overtime?" "It should have been about $1,800, Your Honor," she whispered. $1,800, I repeated slowly. "Mr. Sterling, are you aware that withholding a final paycheck for a disputed debt is a violation of Rhode Island General Law 28144? You cannot just decide to keep someone's wages because you feel they owe you money. You have to get a court order. Did you get a court order?" Sterling crossed his arms. "It's in the contract she signed. She agreed to it. Contract law supersedes labor code." "Incorrect." I slammed my hand on the desk. "You cannot sign away your statutory rights. That clause is illegal. It is void. And by enforcing it, you didn't just breach a contract, Mr. Sterling. You committed wage theft." The term hung in the air. Theft. "And since we are talking about numbers," I continued, "let's talk about the $5,000 figure itself. You claim these are liquidated damages. But for liquidated damages to be enforceable, they must be a reasonable estimate of actual loss, not a penalty. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, what exactly does a warehouse packer do that costs $5,000 to train?" Sterling shifted his weight. "It involves safety protocols, inventory management software, efficiency metrics." "Software?" I asked. Miss Miller, how long was your training? Sarah looked up, her voice gaining a little strength. It was a 4-hour video, Your Honor. We sat in a break room and watched a safety video from 1995. Then they gave us a vest and put us on the line. I stared at Sterling. A 4-hour video. That's your $5,000 training? It's intellectual property, Sterling blustered. The value is in the proprietary knowledge. It is a scam, I shouted, losing my patience. It is a predatory trap designed to keep low-wage workers from leaving bad conditions. You dangle a job, make them sign a promissory note for an exorbitant amount, and then if they try to quit because of your abuse, you threaten to bankrupt them. It is indentured servitude with a corporate logo. I looked at the lawyers. And you, I pointed at the legal team. You officers of the court. You drafted this garbage? You came in here knowing full well this contract wouldn't hold up to a stiff breeze, banking on the fact that Miss Miller couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it. You thought you could use this court as your personal collection agency. The lawyers said nothing. There was nothing to say. But here is the unthinkable part. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You wanted to play by the strict letter of the law? Fine. Let's play. I picked up my phone, the court phone on my desk, and dialed a number on speaker. The dial tone rang through the silent courtroom. Who are you calling? Sterling demanded, his voice trembling. I am calling the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training, I said calmly. And after that, I am calling the Attorney General's office. Because what I am seeing here isn't just a civil dispute, it is a pattern of systemic fraud, and since you are under oath and you just admitted to withholding wages based on an illegal contract clause, I think they will be very interested to hear your testimony. Sterling lunged forward. You can't do that. This is a civil matter. It was a civil matter, I corrected him, until you admitted to breaking the law in my courtroom. Now, it is a crime scene. The line clicked. Department of Labor. How may I direct your call? Sterling's face went pale. He looked at his lead lawyer, desperate. Do something, he hissed. The lawyer stood up, his hands shaking. Your Honor, please. We move to dismiss the case. With prejudice. We withdraw the suit. Oh, you want to withdraw now? I asked, not hanging up the phone. Now that the light is shining on the cockroaches, you want to scurry back into the dark? It is too late for that. You don't get to terrorize a mother and then say, oops, never mind when you get caught. I looked at Sarah. She was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of someone who had been drowning and just felt a hand grab them before they went under. Miss Miller, I asked, ignoring the panic at the plaintiff's table. You said your daughter is in the ICU. How much are the medical bills? Sarah choked back a sob. The deductible it's $7,000. I don't have it. I was going to use my last paycheck to start a payment plan so they wouldn't stop treatment, but he kept it. $7,000. The room spun with the injustice of it. Sterling had stolen $1,800 from her money that could have been keeping a child alive just to prove a point, just to show he could. Hang up the phone, Sterling said, his voice low and defeated. Please, I'll drop the $5,000 claim. Just let me go. You think that's enough? I asked, looking at him with pure disgust. You think you can just walk away after admitting you stole her wages while her child was dying? You think the scales of justice balance out just because you decided to stop punching her? I slammed the phone down, disconnecting the call. Sterling let out a breath of relief, thinking he had won. I won't call the Department of Labor right this second, I said, but only because I have a better idea. An idea that is going to cost you a lot more than a phone call. I turned to my clerk. Calculate the statutory interest on the unpaid wages and look up the penalty for bad faith litigation. Because Mr. Sterling isn't just leaving here with a dismissal. He is about to learn that in my courtroom, the price of arrogance is tax, title, and license. My clerk, a diligent young woman named Maria, who has worked with me for 5 years, handed me a slip of paper. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the adrenaline in the room. I took the paper, put on my glasses, and looked at the numbers. Then, I looked at Richard Sterling. He had slumped back into his chair, the defiance draining out of him, replaced by the sullen look of a child who had been caught stealing from the cookie jar. He still didn't understand the gravity of his situation. He thought this was a negotiation. He thought we were haggling over a price. "Mr. Sterling," I began, my voice echoing in the stillness. "According to Rhode Island general law regarding wage theft, you are liable not just for the unpaid wages, but for liquidated damages up to 2 times the amount, plus statutory interest, plus legal fees." I paused, letting him sweat. "But we also have the matter of frivolous and vexatious litigation. You brought a lawsuit in bad faith, using the court as a weapon to intimidate a vulnerable witness to your own labor violations. The sanctions for that are severe." Sterling reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. A checkbook bound in leather. He uncapped a gold pen. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "Just give me a number. Is it 10,000? 20? I'll write the check right now. Let's just end this farce so I can get back to work." The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, facing criminal exposure, he thought he could buy his way out. He thought his money was a shield that could deflect any moral arrow I fired at him. "Put the pen down, Mr. Sterling," I ordered. He froze. "What? You said there were penalties." "There are," I said, leaning forward. "But you seem to be laboring under a delusion. You think that because you have a fat bank account, you can pay a fine and wash your hands of the dirt you've accumulated. You think justice is a vending machine you put in money and you get your freedom, not in my courtroom." I stood up. I walked down from the bench. Usually, I stay elevated, but today, I needed to look him in the eye on his level. I walked past the stunned lawyers and stood right in front of the plaintiff's table. "If I fine you $20,000, Mr. Sterling, will that change how you eat dinner tonight?" I asked. He blinked, confused. No. "Will it stop you from going on your next vacation? Will it force you to sell one of your cars? Will it make you lose a single hour of sleep?" "No," he admitted, looking away. "Exactly," I said softly. "For you, a fine isn't a punishment. It's a business expense. It's the cost of being cruel. And I am not in the business of selling permits for cruelty." I turned to Sarah. She was clutching the photo of her daughter, watching us with bated breath. This woman, I gestured to her, was willing to lose everything, her job, her reputation, her financial future, just to sit by her daughter's bedside. She paid a price you cannot even comprehend. "And you want to write a check and walk away?" I turned back to Sterling, my voice hardening into steel. "No. Today, we are going to try something different. I am going to offer you a choice, Mr. Sterling. And I suggest you listen very carefully, because your future depends on it." Sterling swallowed hard. "What choice?" "Option A," I said, holding up one finger. "I proceed with the referral to the Attorney General. I hand over the files on the wage theft, the illegal contracts, and the labor abuses. I will recommend a full criminal investigation. Your company will be raided. Your assets may be frozen. You will likely face felony charges for systemic fraud. And given the evidence, you will almost certainly go to prison for 3 to 5 years." The color drained from his face completely. The arrogance was gone. He was terrified. "Prison?" he squeaked. "Option B," I continued, holding up a second finger. "I suspend the criminal referral. I keep the file on my desk. And instead of a fine that means nothing to you, you agree to a different kind of sentence. An unthinkable sentence, as your lawyers might call it." "I'll do it," Sterling blurted out immediately. "Whatever it is. Option B." "Don't be so quick to agree," I warned him, "because option B requires you to do something you haven't done in a very long time. It requires you to be a human being." I walked over to Sarah and gently took the medical bill she had placed on the evidence pile. I walked back and slammed it down in front of Sterling. "This bill is for $7,000, I said. "It is the deductible for Emily's current stay in the ICU. Option B is this. You will pay this bill. Today. In full." Sterling let out a breath, looking relieved. "Done. I'll write the check to the hospital right now." I'm not finished. I cut him off. Leukemia treatment takes years, Mr. Sterling. It involves chemotherapy, radiation, potentially a bone marrow transplant. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that Miss Miller does not have because you stole her wages and fired her. I leaned in close. If you choose option B, you are going to sign a legally binding document today. You will become the personal guarantor for Emily Miller's medical treatment. Not just today, forever, until she is cancer-free. Every pill, every procedure, every hospital stay. You will pay for it out of your own pocket. If she needs a specialist in Boston, you fly her there. If she needs experimental drugs, you buy them. Sterling's mouth fell open. You want me to pay for everything? That could be $500,000. You said you netted $12 million last quarter, I reminded him coldly. You can afford it. The question is, do you value your money more than your freedom? Sterling looked at his lawyers. They were shaking their heads, signaling him that this was crazy, that he shouldn't agree. But they weren't the ones facing prison time. And there is one more condition, I added. The most important one. What? Sterling whispered. You don't just write checks from your ivory tower, I said. You claim Miss Miller was irresponsible for being at the hospital. You mocked her panic. So, you need to understand what you mocked. I pointed to the door. You are going to go with Miss Miller to the hospital. Right now, you are going to sit in that ICU waiting room. You are going to look at that little girl hooked up to those machines. And you are going to apologize to her for trying to take her mother away when she needed her the most. You want me to go there? Sterling looked horrified. I don't do hospitals. Then you can do prison, I said, turning my back on him and walking up to the bench. Bailiff, take Mr. Sterling into custody. We are going with option A. No, Sterling screamed, jumping up. No, I'll do it. I choose option B. I stopped. I turned slowly. Are you sure, Mr. Sterling? Because once you start this path, there is no turning back. If you miss one payment, if you fail to show up at that hospital today, the deal is off, and you go to jail. I'll do it, he said, his voice trembling, his hands shaking as he reached for the pen again. But this time, it wasn't to write a check to me. It was to sign a document that would bind his fate to the life of a little girl he had never met. Good, I said. But don't think this is over. This is just the beginning of your education. I did not go to the hospital myself that afternoon. A judge's place is on the bench, not interfering in the private moments of a family crisis. However, I sent my bailiff, Quinn, to ensure that the terms of option B were executed to the letter. And through his detailed report, and the subsequent security footage that was later submitted to the court for compliance verification, I know exactly what happened when the king of logistics stepped into the kingdom of the sick. The drive to Hasbro Children's Hospital was reportedly silent. Richard Sterling sat in the back of the court vehicle, stripped of his luxury sedan, his entourage, and his cell phone. For the first time in years, he was not in control of the vehicle, nor the destination. He was just a passenger in a reality he had spent a lifetime avoiding. When they arrived at the oncology wing, Sterling hesitated at the entrance. Quinn reported that the CEO looked physically ill. It wasn't the smell of antiseptic or the fluorescent lights that bothered him. It was the realization of where he was. This wasn't a boardroom where lives were lines on a spreadsheet. This was the front line of a war where money was often useless ammunition. As they walked down the hallway, Sterling tried to keep his gaze fixed straight ahead, but he couldn't help but see them. The children. Bald heads, ivy poles decorated with stickers, parents sleeping in chairs with exhaustion etched into their bones. He saw a father crying softly into a vending machine in the hallway. He saw a mother reading a book to a child who hadn't opened her eyes in days. For a man who measured success in efficiency and output, this place was a terrifying anomaly. Here, efficiency meant nothing. Survival was a messy, slow, and heartbreakingly inefficient process. Then, they reached room 402. Sarah Miller didn't wait for him. The moment the door opened, The employee vanished, and the mother took over. She rushed to the bedside, dropping her bag, her hands immediately reaching out to stroke the forehead of the small, frail figure lying in the bed. "Mommy's here, baby. Mommy's here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a tenderness that made Sterling flinch. Sterling stood by the door, stiff as a board. He clutched his $5,000 suit jacket as if it were armor. Lying in that bed was Emily. She was smaller than he expected. Tubes ran from her chest to a bank of machines that beeped in a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. Her skin was translucent, pale as paper, contrasting sharply with the dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together. She opened her eyes. They were large, glassy, and confused. "Mommy?" she rasped. Her voice was weak, a tiny sound in the quiet room. "You came back." "Of course I came back," Sarah said, kissing her hand. "I told you I would." "But the work," Emily whispered. "And this is the part that should haunt Richard Sterling for the rest of his life. You said the boss would be mad. Did you get in trouble? A 4-year-old child, dying of leukemia. And her worry wasn't the pain or the needles. Her worry was that her mother would get in trouble with the boss." Sarah froze. She didn't know what to say. She slowly turned her head and looked at Richard Sterling standing in the doorway. The room went silent. The only sound was the beep, beep, beep of the monitor. Sterling looked at the child. Then he looked at Sarah. He looked at the fear in the mother's eyes, fear not of him, but for her daughter. And then he looked back at Emily. This was the moment. This was the unthinkable test. Sterling took a step forward. His expensive Italian shoes made a sharp click on the linoleum floor. He walked past the foot of the bed. He looked down at the little girl, who he had deemed irrelevant to operations. He cleared his throat. He tried to summon his CEO voice, the voice that commanded boardrooms. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out but a croak. He tried again. "No, Emily," Sterling said, his voice shaking. "Your mommy didn't get in trouble." Emily looked at him, blinking. "Who are you?" Sterling paused. He looked at his hands, hands that had signed thousands of firing slips, hands that had squeezed every penny out of his workers. I'm Mr. Sterling," he said softly. "I'm the boss." Emily's eyes widened. She tried to sit up, fear flashing across her tiny face. "I'm sorry. Mommy didn't mean to leave. Don't be mad." That reaction, the sheer terror a 4-year-old had of him, hit Sterling like a physical blow. He staggered back slightly, grabbing the bedrail for support. He realized then that his reputation wasn't just tough. It was monstrous. It had trickled down from his office, through his managers, to his workers, and finally, into the nightmares of a dying child. No, Sterling stammered, tears suddenly filling his eyes. "I'm not mad. I came to tell you that your mommy is the best worker I have. She is a hero." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he really saw her. "I made a mistake, Emily," Sterling continued, tears now spilling over his cheeks, dripping onto his silk tie. "A very big mistake. Your mommy needed to be here with you, and I am going to make sure she can stay here as long as you need her." He reached into his pocket, not for his checkbook this time. He reached for a handkerchief, but instead he found the gold pen he had tried to use to buy his way out of trouble earlier. He held it out to Emily. "Do you like to draw?" he asked stupidly, desperate to bridge the gap, to stop being the villain in the room. Emily looked at the shiny object. She gave a weak nod. "You can have this," Sterling said, placing the gold pen worth more than Sarah's car into the child's small hand. "And I promise you, Emily, I'm going to take care of everything. You just get better." Sterling turned around and walked out of the room. He didn't wait for Quinn. He walked straight to the waiting area, sat down in a plastic chair, put his head in his hands, and wept. He wept not because he was caught. He wept because for the first time in 40 years, he looked in the mirror and hated what he saw. They often say that human nature is the hardest thing to change. They say a leopard cannot change its spots, and a ruthless CEO who has spent a lifetime optimizing profits cannot suddenly become a philanthropist in a single afternoon. To be honest, in nearly 40 years on the bench, I used to believe that too. I have seen too many defendants make empty promises at the railing only to return to their old ways the moment they stepped out of the courthouse. But Richard Sterling proved me wrong. Or perhaps he proved that even in the most hardened hearts, the seed of compassion can still sprout if watered with genuine tears. After that day at the hospital, Sterling didn't return to his luxury mansion. He didn't go to his reservation at Capriccio's. According to the reports I received later, he went straight back to the headquarters of Sterling Logistics. It was 7 p.m. Most office staff had gone home, leaving only the night shift and the legal team working overtime to handle the mess the morning trial had created. Sterling walked into the conference room, where his lead attorney, the one who had been so aggressive in court, was drafting an appeal. "We are going to countersue, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said without looking up. Old man Caprio overstepped his authority. "We can use the fact that he threatened criminal action in a civil case to void the entire agreement." Sterling said nothing. He walked over to the industrial shredder in the corner. He picked up the thick file labeled Sarah Miller Lawsuit and dropped it into the slot. The sound of the machine whirring and grinding the cold legal papers into confetti was the only noise in the room. "What are you doing?" the lawyer gasped. "That is evidence." "You're fired," Sterling said, his voice strangely calm. "And your firm is fired too. Pack your things and get out of my building immediately." "You're crazy," the lawyer stammered. "Who will protect you from the unions? Who will write the employment contracts?" "I'll hire new people," Sterling replied. "People who know how to write a contract without using the blood of my employees as ink." That was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Logistics underwent an unprecedented surgery. Not a financial restructuring, but a moral one. 6 months later, I convened a hearing to review the progress of Option B. I wanted to ensure that Sterling wasn't just performing a short-term act to stay out of jail. When Richard Sterling entered my courtroom this time, the atmosphere was completely different. He didn't walk in with an entourage. He walked in alone. The shiny Italian suit was replaced by a more modest business attire. But the biggest change was in his face. The deep furrow of arrogance between his brows had relaxed. The look of disdain for the world was gone, replaced by a gaze that was calm and humble. And, more importantly, walking right beside him was Sarah Miller. Sarah looked like a new person. She had gained a little weight, her cheeks were rosy, and the hunched posture of a desperate single mother was gone. She walked with her head held high. "Your Honor," Sterling spoke first, not waiting for me to ask. His voice was warm, lacking the booming echo of authority he used to wield. "I am here to report on the fulfillment of my commitment." He placed a folder on my desk. It wasn't full of legal rebuttals, but of receipts and medical reports. "As of today," Sterling presented, "the total cost for Emily's treatment is $452,000. We transferred her to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston for the latest CAR T-cell therapy. All travel and housing expenses for Sarah and her family have been paid in full." I flipped through the receipts. Every number matched. But I knew money was the easy part for a man like Sterling. "What about the company, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, taking off my glasses to look at him. "I hear there have been big changes?" Sterling nodded. He turned to look at Sarah, and I swear I saw genuine respect in his eyes. "We have completely abolished the penalty clause for employees leaving the company," Sterling said. "Instead, we established a new fund called the Emily Fund. We take 5% of our quarterly profits to provide emergency assistance to any employee facing a family crisis. And most importantly, we have instituted a new policy. No employee will be terminated for caring for a sick family member. That time is now paid leave at 75% of their wage." A murmur went through the courtroom. Such a policy was unheard of in the cutthroat logistics industry. "Do you know that will cut into your margins?" I asked, testing him one last time. "What do your shareholders say?" Sterling smiled. This time, it was a real smile. "Our net profit last quarter dropped by 12%, Your Honor. But our turnover rate dropped to 0%. Productivity is up 20%. And for the first time in 10 years, I can sleep at night without sleeping pills. I think it's a fair trade. I turned to Sarah. Miss Miller, do you have anything you want to say? Sarah stood up. She looked at Sterling, then at me. Her eyes were welling up. Judge Caprio, she said, her voice emotional. When Mr. Sterling came to the hospital that day, I was terrified. I thought he was just acting. But he visited Emily every weekend. He didn't just pay the bills. He sat there and read stories to her so I could take a nap. Emily. She calls him Uncle Rich. He saved my daughter's life, Your Honor, in every sense of the word. Hearing this, Sterling looked down at his shoes, trying to hide the emotion rising in his chest. The man who once viewed employees as cogs was now blushing at being called Uncle Rich. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice gentle but solemn. 6 months ago, I gave you a choice between prison and kindness. You chose kindness, but it seems you have gained much more than just your freedom. Yes, Your Honor. Sterling looked up, his eyes red. I realized how poor I actually was, even with millions in the bank. I almost killed the human part of myself. Thank you. Thank you for forcing me to look in the mirror. I picked up my gavel. This case didn't need a verdict anymore. It needed a happy ending. But before I could bang the gavel, the courtroom doors opened, and a special guest walked in. A tiny guest, wearing a pink beanie to cover a bald head, holding tightly onto the hand of Bailiff Quinn. It was Emily. The silence in the courtroom was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of tension, nor the cold silence of judgment. It was a hushed, reverent silence, the kind you experience when witnessing a miracle. Emily walked down the center aisle. She was small, fragile, yet filled with a life force that filled the room. She held Quinn's hand, but her eyes were scanning the room. When she saw Sarah, she didn't run. She just smiled a smile that lit up the dimly lit space. And then she saw Richard Sterling. Sterling stood up. He didn't smooth his tie. He didn't check his watch. He just stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, looking at this little girl with an expression of pure awe. "Hi, Uncle Rich," Emily chirped, her voice clear and bright. Sterling swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "Hi, Emily. You look strong today." "I am," she nodded. "The doctors said my white blood cells are fighting like ninjas." A ripple of soft laughter went through the gallery. I motioned for Emily to come closer. "Young lady," I said, leaning over my bench with a smile. "Do you know who I am?" Emily looked up at me, her eyes wide. "You're the judge. Mommy said you're the one who made the bad things go away." "Well," I said, glancing at Sterling, "I think we all work together on that. But tell me, why are you here today? Shouldn't you be resting?" "I had to bring you something," she said. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a drawing. I motioned for Quinn to lift her up so she could hand it to me personally. As she placed the paper on my desk, I saw what it was. It was a drawing done in gold ink using the very pen Sterling had given her in the hospital. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. One was clearly her, one was Sarah, and the third figure, drawn with a tie, was holding a bag labeled meds. "That's Uncle Rich," she explained, pointing to the figure. "He's holding my medicine. And that," she pointed to a large figure in the clouds wearing a black robe, "is you. You're watching." I felt a lump form in my throat. In all my years, I have received awards, keys to the city, and plaques. None of them carried the weight of this piece of paper drawn by a 4-year-old with a gold pen. "It is beautiful, Emily," I said softly. "I will frame this and put it in my chambers. It is the best evidence I have ever received." I turned my attention back to the courtroom. The camera crews were zooming in. The gallery was wiping tears. Even the stenographer had stopped typing to watch. "Mr. Sterling," I called out. "Yes, Your Honor," he responded, stepping forward. 6 months ago, you stood there and told me that the law is black and white, that a contract is ironclad, that there is no room for emotion in business. I held up Emily's drawing. Today, looking at this, do you still believe that? Sterling shook his head slowly. No, Your Honor. I was blind. I thought the law was a shield to protect my money. I didn't realize it was meant to be a sword to protect the innocent. You taught me that the most profitable investment a man can make is in another human being. You have paid the medical bills, I noted, looking at the file. You have changed your company policies. You have restored Miss Miller's dignity. But there is one final legal matter to settle. I picked up my gavel. The sound of wood on wood usually signifies an end, a punishment, a finality. Today, it signified a new beginning. The case of Sterling Logistics versus Sarah Miller is hereby dismissed with prejudice, I announced. There are no damages owed. There is no debt remaining. I paused, looking Sterling dead in the eye. However, Mr. Sterling, I am sentencing you to a life term. Sterling looked up, startled. A life term? Yes, I smiled. You are sentenced to life as Uncle Rich. You have entered this little girl's life, and you don't get to walk away when the cancer is gone. You are part of her story now. You watch her grow up. You attend her graduation. You make sure she never has to worry about a medical bill again. Do you accept this sentence? Sterling smiled, and tears streamed freely down his face. I accept, Your Honor. It would be my privilege. Then it is so ordered. I banged the gavel one last time. The courtroom erupted. Not in polite applause, but in a standing ovation. Strangers hugged Sarah. People patted Sterling on the back not because he was a CEO, but because he was a man who had found his way home. As the room cleared, I stayed on the bench for a moment, watching them leave. I saw Sterling lift Emily up so she could reach the water fountain. I saw Sarah laughing, a sound that had been stolen from her for too long. I looked at the empty courtroom, at the flag standing still in the corner, and I thought about the power we hold in these rooms. We have the power to destroy, to punish, to crush. But if we are brave enough, if we are willing to do the unthinkable, we also have the power to heal. I picked up the drawing in gold ink and placed it carefully in my portfolio. This is Judge Frank Caprio. Court is adjourned.